Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Psych Talk. This is your host, Anna Chiara. And today we're going to talk about memory. So, what is memory? Memory is all the emotions, information that you have stored, everything you have learned, and everything you can remember, recall, and talk about. So, in psychology, we describe it as encoding, retaining, and retrieving information about something that is no longer present. And by encoding, we mean translating information, the input that we get from the world, into a mental representation that we personally can understand, so that our brain can understand. By retaining, we mean being able to hold that information. And finally, by retrieving, we mean bringing stored memory or information back into conscious awareness. So something that we can discuss about or something that we can name. In cognitive psychology, we divide memory in sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory, it lasts only for less than a second, and it's basically all the input that we get from the world. So every day you're bombarded with information from your environment, and our brain decides which information we want to attend to, because we have so many information that we cannot attend to everything, otherwise we will go crazy. So when you selectively attend to a specific information, that information goes to short-term memory. Short-term memory holds that information for 18 to 20 seconds. And then if we rehearse that information, it goes to long-term memory. Otherwise, it's gonna get lost. I want to give you an example of short-term memory. So short-term memory is, for example, adding and subtracting and multiplying numbers. It's a space in which you can mentally process and manipulate information. So, for example, you're not pulling out numbers from long-term memory when you're multiplying, for example. So if I tell you multiplied 352 by 534, you have to actually write it down and use your short-term memory. You don't remember the answer to that multiplication because it's not in your long-term memory. Whereas long-term memory has unlimited capacity and it's permanent. I know that many people think that we cannot store more than a certain amount of information, but we actually can. But then why do we forget? So it's not because the information that you learn just goes away, but it's because of different reasons. So the information can become weak. So it weakens over time if you don't, rehearse or talk about that information, something that is just, you never use that information. Or there's something called interference. So basically, recent information interfere with old memories. So it's not that we forget, but we might get confused. For example, so previous information can interfere with new memories. For example, let's say that when you get home, you always put the keys of the car always in the same spot. And one day you actually do not put it in the same spot that you always put it in, but you change spot just because, I don't know, let's say you're very tired and you just want to go to your room or whatever. Then the next day in the morning, and when you need to go to work and you need to get the car keys, you're gonna look for the spot that you always put your keys at. You're not gonna go for the spot that you put it last night, But then you will remember, oh, actually, yesterday I didn't put it in the same spot that I put it every day, but I just moved it because I was tired, I didn't have time, or whatever the reason is. So you got confused. So the previous information, which was putting the key at the same spot every day, interfered with the new memory, which is, oh, I actually changed the spot where I put my keys. There is also something very interesting called misinformation effect. So, for example, when you read an article, and then you read something else that says that what that previous article said was untrue, you will still believe the first article. So, for example, when let's say the media tells you about something that recently happened, or I don't know, something that maybe scientists discovered, etc., and then let's say you listen to the same media and they say, oh, or maybe to another media, and they say, oh, actually the information that we provided before is not true, we discovered that this and that, etc., you will still believe the first information, even though they just told you that the previous information was untrue. And now that we know what memory is, I want to talk about how to remember better. So, we have many research studies about memory, and one of the father of cognitive psychology is Hermann Ebbinghaus, and his first experiments were about memory and retrieval, and what he discovered is that spacing info produced better recalls than massed trials. And what I mean by that is, for example, let's say you have 1 hour to study. Instead of studying for 1 hour without any break, so for 1 hour straight, it's worse. It's worse than studying for 1 hour with breaks. So it's good to take breaks in between. For example, you study for the first 20-25 minutes, then you eat something, and then you go back to studying, and then you, take a nap for 5 minutes, and then you go back to studying. That will help you recall the information better. Also, information that is overlearned requires a long time to forget, which means that once we learn information, it never goes away. It never really goes away, but you need to rehearse it a lot. You need to talk about it a lot. It needs to be present in your life. And there is one saying in Latin, which is repetita juvant, which means, in Italian we will say ripetere giova, in which in English we could say the more you repeat something, the better you will remember that information. Okay, so the first strategy will be spaced rehearsal is better than massed rehearsal. And then there is another strategy that is called encoding specificity. What do we mean by that? Basically, memories are more easily retrieved if external conditions at the time of their retrieval are similar to those that existed when the memory was originally stored. I'll give you an example. So let's say you're in your room and you need to go to the kitchen to grab something. Then you go to the kitchen, you forget what you actually needed, so you go back to your room And then what happens? You actually remember what you needed to grab. So basically, what you learn, the environment where you learn the information is important, because you will recall better the information if when you need to retrieve them, so when you need to talk about them, when you need to, I don't know, maybe take a test or something, if you are in the same environment where you first learned the information. So for example, maybe this, I don't know, was helpful during the pandemic. You studied in your room and then you took a test in your room, which means that you retrieved the information easier compared to people who maybe just studied at home and then they had the test in class. Even though I will argue that when you are in class and you're listening to the lecture and you're learning, etc., then you will retrieve the information during the test because you actually learned information in the classroom setting. So these are some tricks that you can use when you study, when you decide the place where you want to study. But not only the environment is important, also your mood is important. For example, if you're sad when you learned something and you're happy when you need to retrieve that information, you will remember less compared if you were sad when you needed to retrieve the information. Same thing with caffeine. So if you drank caffeine when you studied a topic and you drink caffeine during the test, you will think, oh, that's gonna make me remember better because that's what I told you just now about encoding specificity. But in reality, it's better if you don't drink caffeine during the test. And the reason why is because caffeine makes you feel more alerted. But during the test or like before the test, you will feel alerted without taking caffeine at all, because people in general are nervous and anxious before taking the test. So it's good to drink caffeine before the lecture because you are in that state of mind of, adrenaline. And then when you go and take the test, you don't need to drink caffeine because naturally, your state of mind is naturally more alert. Then we have levels of processing, which means that when you learn something, you have to make it meaningful. So you have to relate it to your life. You cannot just repeat it because, sure, maybe it will work for, when you need to take the test, but then you won't remember in the future. So you need to make it important in your life. You need to connect it with something in your life so that you will remember. Then we have depth of processing encoding variability, which means that you need to create multiple pathways or connections during learning. And how do you do that? So you do that by studying the material in different ways. So for example, let's say at first you read it, then you rehearse, and then you space it out. So basically you study for 30 minutes and then you take a break and then you study for another 30 minutes. And then instead of rehearsing, you can try to connect it with something in your life. For example, this topic that I'm studying reminds me of when my mom did this, or when this happened to me, or it reminds me of something that is going on right now socially. And then what you can do is flashcards. And then what you can do is repeating this information to your mother and then to your friend. And then try to, instead of flashcards, you can try with bullet points or try to write the information down. So you're trying to create connections in your brain to remember this information easier. And then we have reading versus generating. So reading and reading, it's okay for the first times, but like then you need to learn how to generate that information without a textbook. And it's important because if you're able to generate the information, it means that you actually understood it and learned it. So before a task, instead of just reading your notes or reading the chapter, try to generate the information. You can do both, obviously, that's better, but try to generate that information too. And now I want to talk about something that Mary Calkins did in her research and tried to like study, which is the primacy and recency effect. So the primacy effect is when individuals have a tendency to remember the first piece of information they encounter better than other information. So basically, what we learn first, we remember best. So, for example, when you're, when you're at a comedy show or at a concert, or you're listening to the lecture, or you're watching and listening a presentation, you will remember the information that is talked about first than the information that it's in the middle. Whereas the recency effect, we remember info at the end of the list, at the end of the comedy show. So you will remember better the jokes that were told at the beginning of the show and at the end of the show. And so we remember the first and the last words, for example, from a list and not the middle. Or you can try this on yourself. So write down 10 words like dog, cat. Actually, let's do it now. Let me get a pen. I wrote down 10 words and I want you to try to rehearse these 10 words once I tell them to you, and I want to see which ones you remember best. Dog, cat, airplane, kitchen, roof, blue, couch, hair tie, bottle, car. Okay, now try to say all those words. I bet that you remember the first 2-3 words and the last 3. So the first ones were dog, cat, airplane. The last ones were hair tie, bottle, and car. And the middle ones were kitchen, roof, blue, couch. So you can do this trick with your friends if you want to. And also, remember what I'm telling you right now, because let's say you have to present a project, or you need to present something to someone, or you need to be, you need to do your comedy show or whatever. Try to be either the first person or the last person, because people will remember you better. Also, that's what advertising does all the time. So they put, something nice at the beginning of their advertising, and then in the middle all the side effects of the medicine or whatever it is that they're trying to sell, and then at the end they always end with a nice picture of a dog or something cute, so that you actually remember the first thing that you saw and the last thing that you saw, and you don't remember all the side effects that medicine or whatever it is basically has. One more thing that I want to mention is that memory is faulty. Memory is not as reliable as you may think. For example, 1% of people are wrongly convicted every year. And those are eyewitness testimony. And they misidentify people very often, and it's the first source of wrongful conviction. I'll give you an example so that you can understand better. So, for example, there was this lady who it was night. She was watching a movie, not a movie. Sorry, she was watching the news, and in the news there was this very famous scientist, and basically what happened is that someone broke into her house, and he raped her, and this person who broke into her house raped her. And then when she called the police and told what happened, she told them that the person who raped her was basically the scientist that was in the news that night, that was talking about something. But then the police was like, well, that's very improbable, like, because that person has the testimony that he was on TV and he didn't broke into her house and raped her. But her memory, so she was traumatized by that event, and the only thing that she could remember was the scientist speaking on TV, so she thought that that person was actually the rapist. And that happens a lot with like traumatic events. When you, for example, are presented with like a gun or a knife, things like that, people usually don't remember the person who's committing the crime the right way, so they might misidentify that person, like what they were wearing or their face, etc. And that's why in psychology we actually learn and study that eyewitness testimonies are not reliable at all, and they shouldn't be, they should be taken in consideration, but not to actually convict a person for a crime. Okay, this is the last topic that I want to talk about. I didn't think that I was going to talk about it, but I think it's very important and I think people should know about it, so I want to talk about it. So everybody heard about multitasking, right? And people think, or they say, oh yeah, I can multitask, I can do many things at the same time. But in reality, there is no such thing as multitasking. Multitasking equals to switching tasks. We cannot do two things at the same time, but we're switching in between tasks. And I mention this because it's very important that we talk about cell phone use and driving, because you're actually not multitasking. You're literally switching tasks, and using your cell phone can be very dangerous while driving. And there is this research study that has been done by David Strayer. You can look it up on Google Scholar, wherever you want, any reliable source. And so his experiment was basically talking on the cell phone while driving. This is a simulation, so it was kind of like playing a video game with Googles. It wasn't like in the streets. So what he did was having two independent variables, which was the level of difficulty, so low versus high traffic density. And he also made his participants drive while they were talking on the phone, holding the phone, or with a hands-free phone, or no phone at all. And what he discovered is that in the high traffic condition, people who are using either a hands-free phone or a handheld phone has significantly more accidents than those who were not using any phone at all. So whether or not it's a hands-free phone or a phone that you're holding, that doesn't make basically any difference, because you're still getting distracted. And the distraction is not holding the phone. The distraction is talking on the phone, because you're having a conversation, so you're concentrated in that conversation. And interestingly enough, people who were talking on the phone had more car accidents than drunk people. And we don't really know the reason why, but it might be because drunk drivers, because they know that they're drunk, they're being extra careful. And yeah, so basically, I don't know why the law allow people to talk on their phone, even if it's hand-free while driving. That shouldn't be allowed in theory, because in psychology we know that it's the same thing as talking on the phone while holding the phone. Okay, this is the last topic that I talked about. I hope you liked this episode. We talked about memory, sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. We talked about strategies to remember better. We talked about the primacy and the recency effect, the misinformation effect, and the reason why memory can be faulty. And also we talked about why driving while talking on the phone it could be very dangerous, even though it's a hands-free phone, because we've learned that people cannot actually multitask, but they switch in between tasks. See you on the next episode.